Thank you, Louisa. The sushi from Louisa's parents' place is incredibly delicious. I didn't bring my wallet with me, though. You're not going to take money from me, are you? I received a sudden call from my mother-in-law. I tilted my head at her words. Edna, it's really hard for me to say this, but... My name is Louisa. I'm a 32-year-old homemaker. I met my husband at work, and I became a homemaker after we got married. About 7 years later, my father-in-law passed away. He was a very kind and always calm person. My mother-in-law, who doted on him, became very frail. At my husband's suggestion, we decided to live with her to take care of her. After living together for a few months, my mother-in-law hardly spoke and seemed like an empty shell. Occasionally, she would say, "I want to go be with my husband," and start crying. Worried about her, both my husband and I tried our best to support her, taking her to various places and providing emotional care. Our efforts paid off, and gradually, my mother-in-law started to regain her health. After about a year of living together, she was back to her old self, full of energy. Both my husband and I were overjoyed at her recovery. However, my recovered mother-in-law began to reveal her true nature. You see, when we were living separately, we didn't notice, but my mother-in-law was extremely frugal. Having a sense of saving money is a good thing, but her frugality went to extremes. She would reuse bath water for about 3 days, and she wouldn't flush the toilet until it was full, and so on. While I thought her frugality was a bit extreme, it wasn't beyond what I could tolerate, so I went along with it. The problem was her behavior outside the house. She would bring home more than 10 plastic bags from the supermarket, go back for samples multiple times, and stuff her pockets full of free condiments. She had been cautioned by supermarket staff a few times, and it was so embarrassing to shop with her that I also warned her. What's wrong with receiving things that you're free to take? My mother-in-law simply wouldn't listen. Besides, you can't use that many condiments, and it doesn't save much money. Even the plastic bags from the supermarket have "take only what you need" written on them. Nevertheless, my mother-in-law showed no remorse and proudly proclaimed how good she was at saving money to everyone around her. It seemed that my mother-in-law was putting a lot of emphasis on how much she benefited. For her, other people's inconvenience didn't matter. As long as she gained something, it was all right. I had worked at a supermarket during my student days, and I had been troubled by people like my mother-in-law, who took supplies without hesitation. Supplies can add up unexpectedly, and many places are just barely managing financially. So, in those small details, if the store suffered a loss, it could easily go into the red. Perhaps because I knew this background, I couldn't accept my mother-in-law's actions, no matter what. I talked to my husband about it, and he said, "My mom is living with us now, and she feels indebted for causing us trouble. I'm sure she's trying to help us by saving money her own way. Besides, she's finally starting to feel better, and she's found something she wants to do, which is saving. Let's just watch over her for a while." But he didn't really entertain the idea. Indeed, what my mother-in-law was doing didn't amount to crime like shoplifting, as my husband pointed out. My mother-in-law had only recently regained her health, and I didn't want to create waves over such a trivial matter that could potentially affect her well-being. So, I decided to tolerate this issue. Maybe, in a little while, my mother-in-law would become more settled down and stop doing things like this. There was a faint hope for that. Several months passed since we started living together, but instead of settling down, my mother-in-law's actions were gradually escalating. Living together, I came to realize that my mother-in-law had a blunt and assertive personality, and she was very strong-willed. She also loved gossip and engaged in chit-chat with neighbors every day. My mother-in-law had no sense of restraint, and no matter how invasive the topic, she would boldly intrude into it without hesitation. Consequently, My mother-in-law was known in the neighborhood as the most well-informed person. My late father-in-law had served as the head of the neighborhood association for many years and had been active in improving the community on his own initiative. He was highly respected, and my in-laws were held in high regard by the townspeople. That being said, it's mostly thanks to my father-in-law, but my mother-in-law mistakenly believes that she's admired and says, "I'm like the town's advisor here, I'm the one who runs this town," as her favorite phrase. My mother-in-law used her position to act as she pleased. When we went to a family restaurant for a neighborhood gathering at the Senior Citizens Club, she would say, "Oh, I was invited suddenly and forgot my wallet," and she would make others pay. She would find someone giving away vegetables or fruits and strike up a conversation, saying, "Those vegetables look delicious. You must have nurtured them with care," as if it were nothing, complimenting the vegetables. She wouldn't leave until the person offered to share something with her, and in general, she liked to be treated by the people around her, or to make them contribute in some way. The neighbors didn't complain, but they clearly looked troubled. Even when I gently tried to advise her, she would get angry and say they offered to do it themselves, "So it's fine." The way you put it, it sounds like I'm forcing them to treat me or making them pay, and it became impossible for me to handle. One day, when I went shopping, I found my mother-in-law and the neighbor, Mrs. Bell, talking in front of the supermarket. "Hello," I greeted them, and Mrs. Bell, struggling with a heavy box of premium melons, replied, "Hello, Louisa. That looks heavy. Are you okay?" "Oh, it's a bit heavy, because of the melons, and I was afraid to put it on the ground." Seeing Mrs. Bell's relieved expression, I realized that my mother-in-law had her eye on those melons, expecting them to be shared. Our conversation has gone on for a while. It's hot today, and it's best to stop standing around and chatting. We wouldn't want the melons to spoil, right? I can help carry them to the car, I said, forcefully ending the conversation and leaving my mother-in-law behind as she planned to continue shopping. I helped carry the melons to the car. "Thank you for your help, Louisa," Mrs. Bell said, as we carried the melons. "No, it's more like my mother-in-law should apologize. Judging from her behavior, she was indirectly asking you to share those melons, right?" When I asked this, Mrs. Bell awkwardly nodded. "That's right. I had told her that I planned to send these to my son and his wife, so I couldn't share them as usual. But she kept insisting that I should taste them before sending them, and that she had never seen this variety before, so she didn't know how they tasted. She clearly wanted me to share them, and wouldn't let it go." Mrs. Bell looked exhausted as she spoke, and I felt sorry for her. "I'm sorry for the trouble my mother-in-law causes all the time." When I apologized, Mrs. Bell quickly shook her head. "You don't need to apologize, Louisa. You always try to stop her, right?" "Yes, but my mother-in-law never listens to me. Only her husband could really stop her. When he was alive, he used to keep an eye on her, and she never did anything as unreasonable as she does now. She changed so much after he passed away." Indeed, I had never felt that my mother-in-law was stingy or unreasonable before we started living together. Losing her husband must be tough on her, and the neighbors all tried to endure it. But lately, it's become a bit too much, and it's almost unbearable. Mrs. Bell said this, lowering her gaze. I apologized to Mrs. Bell once again, promising to be more careful, and then went home. What my mother-in-law was doing was almost like extortion. While she didn't explicitly state it, the talk among Mrs. Bell and the other neighbors was that everyone was troubled by her behavior. It was not right to keep coddling her and letting her get away with inconveniencing others just because she was mourning for so long. I felt that I needed to do something about it. Thinking this, when I returned to my in-laws' house, it seemed my mother-in-law, who had arrived home before me, was waiting for me, fuming. "Hey, Louisa, what was that earlier? What do you mean by that?" I asked with wide eyes. Interfering with what was going on, of course. We were about to receive a high-quality melon from Mrs. Bell, but because of your interference, we missed out on it. My mother-in-law, breathing heavily and fuming, left me flabbergasted. That wasn't something bought for personal use, it was meant to be sent to her son and his wife. Mrs. Bell said she couldn't share it because of that. I think it's wrong to forcibly take something that someone has said they can't give up. Do you think it's appropriate for a daughter-in-law to give orders to her mother-in-law like that? I got quite the cheeky daughter-in-law. Thanks to you, we missed out on a whole high-quality melon. I thought it was absurd to consider it a loss, when it was something she hadn't even bought herself, but I decided not to argue further, as it would likely lead to more noise. That night, when my husband came home, it seemed my mother-in-law had tattled on me. He scolded me, saying, "Don't provoke your mother-in-law too much." I don't know how my mother-in-law conveyed it, but she likely spun it in a way that made me look like the villain when she talked to my husband. In my husband's mind, it seemed that I had refused the high-quality melon, which we were supposed to receive, as a favor from Mrs. Bell. She wanted that melon so badly, didn't she? You should have understood that, and you could have at least bought one melon yourself, my husband said, always taking his mother's side. I was running out of patience with him. Even if I bought melons with our money in the first place, it was clear that my mother-in-law would get angry, saying, "You're wasting money again." Caught between my husband and my mother-in-law, I was feeling really stressed. Amidst all that, there was some good news. My family's sushi restaurant had undergone a renovation and reopened. The old location had deteriorated, so they moved to a building in the city center. Originally, it was located quite far and required a car to reach, making it a hidden gem. However, after moving to the city center, it seemed that business had picked up. My mother-in-law didn't have a car, so she hadn't visited since the time she came with relatives for a visit. The decision to renovate was made a year ago, but I was somewhat afraid of my greedy mother-in-law finding out, so I kept the renovation a secret from both her and my husband. However, one day, at the supermarket, I ran into a mom friend who frequented my family's sushi restaurant, and we were talking about the restaurant's renovation party when my mother-in-law overheard. When we got home, my mother-in-law, as expected, bombarded me with questions. "Louisa, why didn't you tell me that your family's sushi restaurant had been renovated?" "I'm sorry, I didn't have the chance to. We're family, so we should be sharing that kind of information. There was a renovation party, right? It's strange that we weren't invited to such an important event, don't you think?" Faced with my mother-in-law's barrage of questions, all I could do was apologize. "I'm sorry. It was a small party where I invited acquaintances from my hometown." My response didn't seem to satisfy my mother-in-law, but she quickly smiled and said, "Well, that's okay. We'll be relying on them a lot from now on, so we'll have plenty of opportunities to go. It's so convenient that it's in a building near the next station." I had a bad feeling about her grinning like that, and my unpleasant premonition would soon prove to be spot on. One day, while I was doing household chores as usual, I received a sudden phone call from my mother-in-law. "Thank you for the meal, Louisa. The sushi from your family's place is incredibly delicious," she said on the phone, laughing cheerfully. "Huh, did you go to my parents' place to eat?" "Yes, with relatives." I was surprised that my mother-in-law of all people went out to eat. "If you had told me, I could have invited you too. That's why I'm calling now. Even though I told the restaurant staff we were family, they claim they don't know us at all. We thought it was a treat from Louisa's family, so we didn't bring our wallets. You won't charge us, right? So come over here quickly and explain the situation." My mother-in-law's voice was filled with irritation, but I glanced at the calendar nearby and furrowed my brows. Today is the restaurant's regular day off. My family's place is closed today.
Are you sure you didn't mistake the restaurant? There was a brief silence.
Huh? That's not possible. It's in the building next to the station, right? The location is correct, but I remember there being another sushi restaurant in that building.
When I mentioned the restaurant's name, my mother-in-law became furious.
It's a completely different place. It's probably because you didn't properly communicate the name that I got confused.
Even though she said that, I hadn't uttered a word about the restaurant's information. My mother-in-law misunderstood after prying into things. Furious, she said over the phone,
"You should take responsibility and come pay."
But I had no obligation to go and pay.
Aren't there relatives with you? Just have one of them pay,
I suggested, and my mother-in-law became even more frantic.
I told everyone, today you can eat for free, so dig in. Even though they asked me multiple times during the meal, "Are you sure it's okay to eat this much?" I said it was fine. Now, after saying that, I can't ask for payment. Even so, unless someone pays, it becomes a dine and dash.
I replied, and my mother-in-law yelled,
"That's why I'm telling you to come and pay right away. I'm outside making this call now, but I'm keeping the relatives waiting inside. Hurry up and bring the money."
Without hesitation, I replied to her words,
"I don't know anything about it. It's not my concern. You've always relied on others' wallets, and now the chickens have come home to roost. What are you saying to your mother-in-law? I won't forgive this. I'll spread your bad reputation to the neighbors."
My mother-in-law threatened, but I wasn't scared at all. After the incident with Mrs. Bell, I had the opportunity to talk with various neighbors. They were all fed up with my mother-in-law's behavior, and the trust my father-in-law had built up had completely eroded. Our neighbors were actually supportive of my efforts to deal with my mother-in-law, so it was unlikely they would side with her, saying whatever she did.
"If you want to do that, go ahead. I won't come over to pay anyway,"
I said and hung up the phone. After that, my mother-in-law called me many times, but I continued to ignore her completely. Even in the evening, my mother-in-law didn't return home. During dinner with my husband, she was finally brought back by her relatives. When my mother-in-law returned, she seemed completely dejected. The sushi restaurant she mistakenly entered was even more upscale than my family's. Dining there normally costs no less than $400 per person. They ate as a large group, so the bill was nearly $8,000. To cover this cost, the relatives apparently went through a lot of trouble.
"Mom, what on earth have you done?"
After hearing the story, my husband finally scolded his mother.
"It's your fault, Louisa. You gave me the wrong restaurant name. To begin with, I didn't tell you anything about my family's restaurant. You probably heard it on your own and made a mistake. You haven't said anything about going to the restaurant."
I retorted sharply, and my mother-in-law fell silent.
"Edna, you always say things like, 'I forgot my wallet,' and make others pay, right? Everyone is fed up with your actions. Please learn from this and stop doing such things."
When I said this, my husband, who had been quiet until now, spoke up.
"I've been lenient with you until now, but if you cause trouble to others, it's different. Reflect on your actions, and you have to take care of this expense yourself."
My mother-in-law was quite dejected, even though my husband had been gentle until now. Even my husband, who had never listened to me before, said,
"I can't believe my mom would do something like this. I'm sorry for not listening earlier. We'll stop living with my mom, and I promise to change. Just don't divorce me,"
and he apologized. To be honest, I had thought my husband would take his mother's side, so it was surprising that he went this far. I loved my husband, so I gladly accepted his proposal. Afterward, we haven't stopped living with her after all. When I told the neighbors about the incident, all of them asked me not to move out. I thought maybe it's because they would miss having my mother-in-law's chaperone, but I also liked our friendly neighbors, and moving would incur expenses. My mother-in-law has become quite docile now, and considering the future, it seemed better to continue living together. In the end, my mother-in-law paid for the expensive sushi from the money my late father-in-law had left for emergencies. Due to this payment, she almost depleted the money left by my father-in-law, and my mother-in-law, who had adored him, became quite depressed. Her newfound stinginess seemed to stem from vague anxieties about the future. She had been a full-time homemaker, always relying on her beloved husband, and losing him must have made her very anxious. I too am frightened at the thought of suddenly losing my husband. In that sense, I can understand my mother-in-law's feelings. Moreover, my reformed mother-in-law decided to start working part-time to save up for her retirement home expenses, and she struggles every day with the unfamiliar labor. Inspired by her, I'm considering getting a job as well, but recently, I found out I'm pregnant. For now, I want to prioritize raising my child. As evidenced by this blessing of pregnancy, my relationship with my husband has improved significantly. While it has been challenging in various ways, ultimately, it deepened our family bonds and brought us closer to our neighbors, so maybe it wasn't such a bad experience after all.